Oliver, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank all of you here in New York and in Brussels and Moscow and Washington for joining, whether by video or phone, or of course in person. It's great to be here with you, and appreciate the invitation from Oliver and HR to do another training session. I always enjoy those opportunities, and I'm grateful for your time as well. Today what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about a topic that I think is of interest, certainly to me, but I think to all of us here at the East-West Institute, and that is the question of Russia and China, and from a socio-cultural standpoint, what those two countries and two cultures have in common and where they differ from an American perspective. And I think it's something that is very important to me as I work directly with both the countries, as many of you do as well. And this is something that goes back to my service at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow some years ago, when I had the opportunity to work there shortly after having worked in Beijing. And what I realized shortly after arriving in Moscow in the summer of 1998 was that, not ever having lived there before and only having visited once just for a few days, a lot of things in Moscow and in Russia seemed very familiar to me, to a greater degree than they should have been based on my very limited time in the country. So I kind of had an instinct for how things would go and how people would react to certain situations and how certain work scenarios would play out. And at first, I wasn't quite sure why this all seemed so natural and why I seemingly was able to kind of understand what was going on. And then what I realized fairly quickly into my time in Moscow was that a lot of the things that the assumptions that I was making and the things that I was seeing play out were informed by my, at that time, 4 years of experience living in Beijing. And so what I realized was there was an awful lot of interesting commonalities as well as some differences. And so early on in my tour at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, I started making a list of things just as they popped into my mind. And I'm pleased to show you, this is the list that I made. It was a running list. I'm sure the folks viewing from a distance or listening can't see it as well. But basically I kept a running tab of just interesting kind of commonalities, differences, and thoughts that I had about the two cultures. And after about 3 years, nearly 3 years living in Moscow, I finally decided to bring all of these strands together and create a presentation, which I first did in Moscow in 2001. And what was significant about that was, in that particular audience, was an awful lot of Russian folks, but also a pretty good number of Chinese folks who were studying or working in Moscow at the time. So I had an opportunity very quickly to reality check the presentation with authoritative audiences from both of the countries that I was talking about and from both of the cultures that I was talking about. And you know, it can be a bit of a nerve-wracking thing to go in and as an American or as anybody else to try to make statements about other people's cultures and values and things like that. I'm cognizant of that, having lived overseas 9 years, and I'm sensitive to the sensitivities. But I was very pleased that the reaction from everybody was, you know, basically that sounds about right. So that gave me a heart to do the presentation again. And over the years, I've done this a couple of different times. But I thought, again, it was very appropriate for the work that we do here at the East-West Institute, where so much of what all of us do has some relevance or relation to, I should say, Russia and China. So with that, let me just lay out what I'd like to talk about this morning, this afternoon, Brussels and Moscow time. And that is basically a number of very significant areas of commonality between Russia and China, again, from an American perspective. And specifically, I want to talk about 4 categories of issues. So as I made my list, there were just random thoughts on a piece of paper that I wrote down literally over the period of about two plus years. But what I then did was took all of that raw data and broke it down into what I think are logical and interesting categories. So that it's not just a random laundry list of things, but rather that we look at it more methodically and systematically. And the 4 categories that I want to share with you today are as follows. Number 1, basically individual and interpersonal sort of phenomena. Secondly, the relationship between individuals and society. Third, social organization. And 4th, national identity. So as you can see in my presentation, I go from the micro to the macro. I go from the individual to the nation, and with a couple of steps along the way. And here, again, what I want to do is draw some interesting comparisons between Russia and China. And then at the end of the presentation, or toward the end, I want to just say a few words about what I think are some of the most significant differences between the 2 countries. And again, grouped in these 4 categories. So let me start with the interpersonal or individual level, which is the micro level, sort of the individual unit of society being the individual and how that individual relates to other individuals. And here, I think very early on in my time in Russia, having spent a lot of time in China, I started to see similarities very, very quickly. The first one that I would point out, and let me note that there's probably about 7 or 8 different items in each of these 4 categories. So I'll give you a list and I'll give you a brief example or 2 of what I'm talking about for each of these topics. So first of all is the issue of what the Russians would call blot, or what the Chinese would call guanxi, which is the notion of connections, the notion of relationships, and the notion of using those relationships to achieve certain ends in your life. In both Russia and in China, that concept is very potent and very pervasive in society and in life. And basically the notion is to get things done, to really get things done that matter in those 2 societies. Certainly historically, and I think to a large degree even today, it's about who you know and it's about how you leverage those relationships. And I think that notion of relying on contacts, relying on connections, as we might say it, is much more pronounced in both Russia and China than it is in the United States. So in this country, I think we have a scenario where basically if you want to get a driver's license or you want to get a permit or you want to do something in life and in society or in the economy, you go down to the office, the Department of Motor Vehicles or whatever, and you stand in line and you do it. And it takes an hour and a half, and you're done. But a lot of these kinds of things, particularly historically, took more than that in these communist or immediately post-communist societies. It took knowing the person who could really expedite the process, or who could get you ahead in line, or who could get you in, as they say in Chinese, the back door. And so this reliance on relationships is something that I think is a very important commonality in working in Russia and working in China. The second point I would make under interpersonal or individual is the notion of friendship. I think both Russians and Chinese would say that they have a rather different notion of friendship than Americans do. I think they would say, in many cases, that their notion of friendship perhaps goes somewhat deeper than the American notion of friendship. And that when a Russian or a Chinese use the term friend in those respective languages, that they mean a quality and depth of relationship that perhaps Americans don't necessarily mean, in their view, when we use the word friend in English. And I think both Russians and Chinese would tend to think that Americans tend to be somewhat more casual in our friendships. I often have heard Chinese say over the years that, and I think this is somewhat more pronounced in China than in Russia, this observation, that somehow Americans are rather casual about our friendships, and that we make friends easily, but we sort of discard friends easily. Now bear in mind, a lot of these observations, and I think it's worth noting at this juncture, but it's applicable to the entire presentation. Bear in mind that as I was kind of making these observations, there wasn't anything called Facebook, and social media and things like that, which is an interesting point, because now the notion of, quote, friendship, certainly in the U.S. and Western context, has borne some influence from the notion of how many people can you meet and sort of accumulate on Facebook to some degree, hence the term friending and so on. But back pre-Facebook, and there was a pre-Facebook era for some of the younger folks in the room, the notion of friendship really was about a relationship, and again, both Russians and Chinese, I think, drew these judgments about kind of easy come, easy go in the U.S. cultural context. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that, but I've heard that a lot from folks in Russia and China who both feel that they come from a tradition where a friend would literally just about lay down their life for you and certainly give you the shirt off their back. A third point that I would make, that as you can see, some of these relate to each other, is the idea of attitudes toward strangers or foreigners. I think both in Russia and in China, and with recognition that there are some nuanced differences here as well, there are, I think, significant differences between the Russians and the Chinese on the one hand and Americans on the other in how we view strangers or foreigners. Whether it's the guy that you meet on the street or on the bus or in some other unscripted social interaction. Generally, I think Russians tend to be a little gruffer and a little bit more wary of that initial reaction. And I think to a certain degree, Chinese as well, maybe to a slightly lesser degree than Russians. There's also a different dynamic of if that stranger is not just a, let's say, fellow Russian or fellow Chinese, but let's say an American tourist in Beijing or someone who's working there or in Moscow, then that's a slightly different dynamic. But I think there is a sense of us and them, and I think there is a sense of the stranger and the foreigner as being, in a sense, distant from the cultural center of those two countries, and thus regarded and dealt with somewhat a greater level of wariness than is the case in the United States, where we bump into someone on the street, generally, and say, oh, hey, how you doing, and strike up a conversation, and smile, and chit-chat in the elevator, and those kinds of things that I think happen more here than they do in Russia and China. So how we deal with that person we don't know, who's not, quote, a friend, who's not in our circle. There's a big difference between Russia and China on the one hand and the United States on the other. Titles, fourth point. I think that both Russians and Chinese tend to give a lot of weight to titles to a greater degree than we do here in the United States. It takes different forms, but basically there's a level of formality, whether it's a student dealing with a professor, and I should note I taught 2 courses in Moscow at Vladimir Ivanov's alma mater in MIMO, the Moscow State Institute for International Relations, so I was a professor in a Russian classroom for 2 semesters, and I felt this in a personal sense, but it's also true more broadly. If someone's a professor, they're a professor. You wouldn't ever think of contemplating calling that professor by their first name, as so many folks in this country, particularly at the graduate level, do. There's a sense of this person earned this title, they have a PhD, they're a scholar, they have deep credentials, and we show respect for that. Absolutely true in China as well. But it's not just in the academic sense. Whereas we might invite a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State or Defense to come speak here and give a presentation, and we might refer to him as Frank or Sally. But in the Russian or Chinese context, it would always be a reference to the title. So Deputy Assistant Secretary Smith, or Assistant Secretary Jones, or Director so-and-so. And so I think that formality is something that I've noticed both in Russian and Chinese culture, a sense of recognizing where people are, if you will, in the hierarchy, where people are in the pecking order. That's something that I think is much more pronounced in both of those cultures than it is in the United States. The next point I would make is the issue of face. I think a lot of us talk about that and understand that in Asia the question of face is important. I would say in both Russia and China, the issue of face is very important. I think it's important in a lot of places, and I think to some degree it's important in the United States. But I would say that in my 9 years in China and Russia cumulatively, and quite a few more years here in the United States, I would judge that there's a greater emphasis on considerations of face in both Russia and China than there is in the United States. Whether that manifests itself in terms of someone hosting a dinner and it being very important that they host and that they show that they are extending hospitality, or whether it's an officialdom or whether it's in culture more broadly, I think this is something that really matters in Russia and in China to a level that it doesn't in the United States. And I do think there's a real difference there. One little example one can point to in the Chinese context, and you see it to a lesser degree in Russia, but you see it a lot in China, and I've seen it even recently in the last couple of weeks in a Chinese restaurant. And that is when two old Chinese friends are going out to a meal, sometimes you will literally see, and I've seen it 50 or 60 times in my life at least, a physical scuffle over who pays the bill, with each person physically making every effort to wrest the bill from the other person and take it to the counter first and pay the bill, him or herself, rather than their friend paying it. To the point where, odd as it may sound, I've seen good friends who've known each other 30 and 40 years literally get to a level of physicality, of pushing and tugging, that you would not expect from good friends. And it may sound funny, but it happens a lot. And it's because of the notion of, hey, I'm taking you out, I'm never going to let you take me out, this is on me. And they will literally just about fight for that privilege. And you see that, I think, to a certain degree in Russia as well. So the notion of face is very important. Number 6, the notion of indirectness of expression, or what might be called a more reserved style of communication, or kind of a lesser degree of forthrightness. In various ways, I think both, it's not absolute and there are nuances, but I do think that generally a kind of indirectness is the norm in communications to a greater degree in Russia and China than in the United States. But here again, I would draw a distinction between Russia and China, noting that in Russia, indirectness is even more pronounced than it is in Russia. And people will oftentimes go to great lengths to kind of take the winding road to make a point in a way that causes less offense, or that puts an awkward situation in someone's lap to a lesser degree. But particularly in China, to a lesser degree in Russia, people will make an effort to frame things and state things in a way that is less offensive, less combative perhaps, a little bit more indirect, and that way sort of easier to deal with, particularly if it's an unpleasant scenario or a disagreement or a fight. And so sometimes you get scenarios, and I think this is more true in China than Russia, but I think it's true to some degree in both, in which yes can mean no, and no can mean yes in terms of business negotiations or sort of navigating the cultural milieu. Sometimes if you're trying to get approval to do a project and someone says, well, in not so many words, well, that sounds good, and that I think it sounds positive, let's look into it, and it could well mean an absolute show-stopping no. But it may sound to the untrained ear like a yes. So in the United States, in contrast, I think we tend to be much more forthright, direct. Yes, of course, polite. Yes, of course, we honor the protocol needs of the situation. But at the same time, I think generally speaking, we pretty much come out and say what we mean to a greater degree than is the case in Russia and China, where there's a greater indirectness of style. Another point that I think I would make toward the end of this category, and I won't dwell on it, but I think it's notable. In both Russia and in China, I think attitudes toward women are somewhat different than in the United States. They're somewhat, in a nutshell, more traditional. And in terms of expected gender roles in terms of how men interact with women, in terms of the kind of discourse between men and women. And in a sense, these are both cultural contexts in which I think there tends to be a more traditional approach to women, to their role in society, to their role in political life, and social and economic life. And I think in both of those cases, that stands in some contrast to where things are in the United States today. Point number 8, and I touched on this earlier, but there's a different facet to it. I mentioned attitudes toward strangers, and I also mentioned foreigners. But I think it's also worth noting that there's a very different attitude in Russia and China toward foreigners, per se, foreign citizens, and toward foreign nations, I would say. And I think there is a greater level of wariness toward the intentions of other countries. I think both Russia and China are nations that have gone through a lot, to put it mildly, in the last 100 years. Many nations have, but I don't think any nations more than Russia and China have gone through almost unfathomable social, political, economic, and really revolutionary upheavals. And there's a sense in both countries that, to one degree or another, that it's kind of us against the world. And so oftentimes you see that manifested just in terms of the work that, let's say, East-West Institute does, with Russia and China being on the same side of issues in the United Nations, when many, many other countries are on the other side of the issue. And they come to that place from different places in their own history, from different sources in their own history and culture, but they get more or less to the same place. And it's a place of, we need to hunker down and be aware that no one's got our back except us. And it's us against the world, and there's a wariness and an apprehension, and frankly, a mistrust of foreigners and foreign nations that is much higher in both of those countries than is the case in the United States, generally speaking. Yes, we in the United States have friends, and we have adversaries, and we have good friends, and we have medium friends, and we have allies, and we have countries that are sort of neutral, but we do have emotional bonds and bonds of trust with many nations around the world. That is not true of Russia or China to nearly the same degree. China, for example, doesn't have a single ally on the planet Earth, but intentionally. They don't want allies. North Korea, they have a friendly relationship, but it is not an alliance. We have alliances with dozens or scores of nations in this country. So I think that reflects, among other things, this wariness about foreign nations and their intentions. The final point that I would end on for the interpersonal section, before going to how the individual interacts with society, is the issue of hospitality. Again, this is at the individual level. I think both Russians and Chinese put an enormous premium on hospitality and on really taking care of guests, and in particular taking care of guests from afar, or foreign guests in particular, but also just guests generally, including from their own cultural context. There's a real premium, I think, in both countries placed on rolling out the red carpet and being a terrific host and being warm and serving incredible quantities of terrific food in one's home and alcohol and so forth and so on, and basically making someone feel like they are a member of your family and that you're loved and respected and appreciated. I think the Russians and the Chinese go to even greater degrees in the expression of that than we do in this country. Not that we're not warm, inviting, and hospitable, but I think they go to levels to show that warmth that we don't feel compelled to go to in this country as a cultural matter. And that's something that I have to say as I smile, I've been on the receiving of many times, and I'm deeply appreciative of and grateful for the tremendously warm treatment that I've had and that I've been accorded over decades working with China and Russia. So that concludes the section on the individual and how individuals relate to other individuals. I think you can see there are a lot of things, a number of things where Russia and China have some real and significant, and I would argue deep-seated cultural commonalities relative to the United States. Now, the second category is how the individual deals with society. And this is a different type of category of interaction. So I think if you look at Russia and China, you see a number of things where, again, there are some similarities between those two countries and cultures and some distinctions between them on the one hand and the United States on the other. For one, I think you see an emphasis on the center and on a top-down style of politics that includes the notion of the importance of a strong leader. That's something that I think culturally is much more the norm in Russia and China than it is in the United States. We tend to see the world in this country as bottom-up. We tend to see the world through the prism of grassroots and organization and people going out and forming groups themselves and neighborhoods forming associations, and here in New York, community associations and city council and the Rotary Club and so forth and so on. Even organizations like EWI, which is an NGO, which is a private organization, privately funded, that's out there doing its own thing, sort of in that civil society space. But what you see in both Russia, and we see it dramatically there, relative to even where Russia was, let's say, in the mid-1990s, and of course we see it in China, is much more of a center-focused, top-down approach, where things start at the top and trickle down. I won't use the word trickle-down government in this context because that's been used in other contexts, but the idea is that things start in the center and directives flow from the top. That is not a way that we look at things in the United States, but it is a very significant commonality between both Russia and China. I would argue, though, that one distinction that's significant, Russia, I think, still very much buys into the notion of a top-down leader culture and a strong leader culture, whereas the Chinese started with a very strong leader/dictator culture, but moved to a much more collective leadership culture in which instead of one person making all decisions with finality, you have 9 people who collectively make those decisions with finality. And so it's not one individual, it's a collective, but it's still a top-down approach. That distinction, however, I think is important. Second point that I would make is the question of political apathy, or what I might call a sense of disconnect with the political system. In both Russia and in China, most citizens feel very disconnected from their politics. I would say to an even greater degree than is the case here in the United States. It's often noted that many people in the United States don't vote. In an average presidential election, about half of Americans don't vote. Last time, I think the number was down to only 40% who did not vote. That was a record low. But the fact is that most Americans at one level or another feel connected to our politics for a number of different reasons. Not least, we do, of course, have the opportunity to cast a meaningful ballot in elections at all levels. And of course, we all pay taxes in one way or another. And so we feel a connection to the notion of financing our government. In Russia and in China, there's a much greater level and sense of disconnection from the operations of government for a couple of obvious reasons. In the Chinese case, of course, you've got a top-down communist style of government that the Chinese constitution itself refers to as a dictatorship. The Chinese constitution calls its form of government a dictatorship, namely a people's democratic dictatorship, but the noun is dictatorship. So it is not a system in which the average person casts a ballot or exercises significant or any control over who ultimately governs the country. And that results in a sense of disconnectedness and also apathy. In the context of Russia,
Hey, David, real quick on that. I had a fascinating discussion last night with one of my students, who's a Chinese kid from in and around Beijing, not from Beijing. His comment was that much more frequently now, the citizens are voting with the net. And there are numerous cases where the citizens, the case that he used last night was the mayor with the Rolex in a starving town. And so this thing went on to YouTube, and he told me within a matter of days, that mayor was fired. So it's interesting that his perspective was that the connectivity within China is now to such an extent that they're able to influence just via, he said they stopped tracking the number of protests in China because they had tracked it up until 2006, and then they said, we're not tracking it anymore because it's too much out of control. Is that what you're finding is that what you said is sort of reversing its way around now via social underlying problems?
Yeah, what I would say, Jim, is that I think that, number one, the protest that you mentioned is emblematic of what I'm talking about, which is the reason they're protests is because they don't have access to the channels of change within government that we do. So I would argue that the protests, of which there are a very, very substantial, or even an enormous number of protests, that big and small, that go on in the country, that are generally not fully reported here and certainly not fully reported there externally. That goes to the fact that people don't feel that they have any means or levers within the system to affect change. And so too, I would make the point that while of course it's true that there are a lot of bloggers in China, the last statistics that I've seen put the number of bloggers or microbloggers in China at over 200 million. Some of them have one reader. A lot of, in fact, the great majority have one reader or three readers, but some of them are enormously popular and have many millions of readers. But nonetheless, that too, I think, is symptomatic of the point that I'm making. Not a contradiction to it, but in a sense, a fuller analysis of what the impact of the phenomenon that I'm describing is, which is because people don't have the same access to the opportunity to cast a ballot, the opportunity to run for office, the opportunity to set up organizations in a fully free sense, they have to resort to these other means of expression, and the blogosphere now is one that is significant in China. So I think that's a symptom of the point that I'm making, and it's a good point to raise. Similarly, you see a similar dynamic playing out in Russia, where even though people do nominally have the opportunity to go to the ballot booth and cast a ballot for president or governor. In fact, there were just elections a few days ago, I think on Sunday, in Russia. 5 governor seats and a whole bunch of city council and state, what we would call state legislature, regional legislatures. People go and cast a ballot, but I think most disinterested and objective observers would say that there are some fundamental problems with that process now on a very unlevel playing field. And people do feel like they don't have the ability to exercise a decisive impact on the leadership and the course of the nation. And I think that's why you see, again, the protests that we've seen over the last year or so since last December in Russia, which is rather unprecedented in terms of the scale in the modern era. And that's why we see these continual instances of protests, whether it's the punk rock band that we've heard about, whether it's people going to the streets to monitor elections or any other number of different things. That notion of feeling disconnected is very prevalent in both countries. That said, I think we do see an uptick in social activism in both countries, primarily as a function of what's happened with the internet. The third point I would make is, again, going to how the individual relates to society, is the issue of a weak sense of public space. So you see this, I think, in both Russia and in China. It's often talked about in China, where you have courtyard living, let's say, where you have big apartment buildings surrounding a courtyard, and everyone takes pristine care of their place, but nobody really takes care of the entire building or the courtyard, because it's not any one person's problem, and the mindset is, that's somebody else's problem. I'll do my thing, I'll sweep in front of my door, I'll clean up my place, it's beautiful, it's nice, warm, cozy, but public spaces are not my problem, and therefore you see a kind of dilapidation in many cases in sort of the mid-level areas, whether in Moscow or in Beijing or various other cities in both countries. Not that we don't see that in the United States by any means, but I think there is often more of a sense here of we're in this together. We have co-op associations or co-op boards, condo associations, community associations, neighborhood associations across the country that hold little July 4th parades, that go out and clean up the streets, that maybe do a neighborhood watch. So there's a sense of public space in a physical sense. It's not just where I live, it's my community. And I think by degree there's a meaningful distinction to draw there between Russia and China on the one hand and the United States on the other. I mentioned earlier the notion of titles. I think that the fourth point I would make under this section is that there's also a distinction in how we view hierarchy. I think both Russia and China tend to be much more sort of hierarchy and rank conscious than the United States is. We see that in a number of different forms, but just to use one example that I think is a linguistic example that speaks to this issue, in both Russian and in Chinese, as in some other languages, you have a distinction in the word you. You for respectful, or adult, or senior person, and you for friend, or child, or closer family member, and so on. You don't have that distinction linguistically in the United States. But you do have a distinction in both Russian and China, and I think it's emblematic of a broader series of distinctions about hierarchy. But there's, I think, much more of a sense of, in Russia and in China, a sense of when you speak to someone in power or speak to an important businessman or businesswoman, or when you speak to someone who is a high-ranking party official or so on, that there is a way of communicating with that person that is not as informal and not as colloquial as we might feel comfortable referencing, speaking to our leaders or other influential people, or even our presidents, let's say. You often hear in this presidential campaign that we're in the home stretch of now, people referring to the president as a guy. So his aides, his closest aides, or chief of staff, or others will say, well, he's not the kind of guy that would do this or that would do that. He's the kind of guy that in a debate would say this or would say that. And that is emblematic, I think, of a high level of informality that we have even with our president. And when average citizens, as we'll all see tonight, those who aren't watching the Yankees game, when average citizens watch this debate, they're going to see average folks talking to both of these gentlemen just like we would talk to each other in many ways. So, but you don't see that in Russia and China. So I think that differentiation in terms of hierarchy is pronounced in those two cultures. A fifth point is actually a very interesting one, and I think profound as well. It's the notion of destiny. And that is, I think in the United States, one of our fundamental precepts in this country is that we believe that our destiny is ours to create. That's a very fundamental strain of Western and American civilization, or Western civilization and, let's say, American political culture and American culture more generally. We create our destiny. We have choices. We're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. We are endowed by our Creator, in a sense, with the ability to make moral distinctions. It goes back to Adam and Eve and the apple. And so we're the authors of our fate. And in a sense, interestingly enough, we see this very strain of discussion playing out in the presidential campaign in this country over the issue of, did we build that? And it's interesting that this notion of our authorship of our destiny is very much at play, even in this presidential campaign, even as it is also a profound strand of our culture. But in Russia and in China, I think folks there, generally speaking, and I'll caveat this in a moment, generally speaking, have felt for a long, long time, centuries, or millennia in some cases, that their futures are not theirs to create. That their futures are shaped by factors that lie outside of their immediate control. That they don't have the opportunity to go in and historically in particular, and vote for their governments. And they don't have the opportunity to choose their professions as freely, or choose their schools or majors, or choose where they live, or choose whether they go overseas. All of these things historically in Russia and in China, and to a certain degree today, but less so than before, were really the purview of the state, not the purview of the individual. That has changed a lot, unquestionably. And only now I think you're starting to see a change in how people sense their own sense of destiny, and how people understand their own sense of destiny. But I would say that historically, the norm in both Russian and Chinese culture is one of, this is beyond my control, and there's not much I can do to shape the future of my own life and the life of my family. What I think is the most significant change that has occurred in China, and arguably a significant change that to a degree has occurred in Russia, but it's still not complete, is the notion of an increasing level of influence over one's destiny. If I had to summarize in one sentence the fundamental change that has occurred in China in the last 30 years, it's that people today feel a greater sense of control over their fate than they ever have in history. That is not as true, I would argue, in Russia. I would argue. Some may disagree. But I think a lot of the people that I talk to would, including in Russia, would agree that that's a prevalent sentiment and one of the challenges that Russian society faces. The sixth point I would make under individual and society is what I call, and again, this is in the language of 2001, which at that time was current, but I'll use it here just to make a point. The rise of the new Russian and the rise of the new Chinese. So as I mentioned, this notion of destiny is still out there, but in fact, it's beginning to change. I would say for the better. People are beginning to have more of a feel of that they can make a difference in their own lives. And a part of that is the rise of a greater level of middle-class level affluence in both Russia and China that is increasingly becoming more widespread. I would say that is more true in China today than it is in Russia, but it's true in both places. And so people have much more money, far more resources. They do, in fact, in many ways have far more choices, at least economically and socially, than was ever the case before. I'd say in both countries, but especially in China. And so they're now sort of the up-and-coming Russians and Chinese, what used to be called New Russians back in the mid to late 1990s. And I coined the term at that time, New Chinese, referencing the concept of New Russians, being defined as people that have more money than their parents did and more choices than their parents did. And as a result of those two things that are beginning to have slightly different values than their parents did as well. And so you do see a rise of wealth, you see an expansion of the middle class, and you see a level of choice and a level of financial choice as well that was not the case some years ago. And then the final point I would make here is I think that in terms of how the individual and society interact, is that I think Russians and Chinese in many regards are somewhat more conservative. In certain regards are more conservative than Americans. I should also note, I think in other regards they're not as conservative, but on the whole, I think both Russian and Chinese folks tend to be somewhat more traditional, and therefore somewhat more conservative in their core set of social values. You know, one example where it manifests itself both in Russia and in China in a way that is quite different from what we see here as a norm in the United States is on the question of homosexuality. So both Russia and China tend to see homosexuality as problematic, as something that is quote, not right, it's bad, etc., whatever word you want to choose. In the United States, we're long beyond that point of view as a nation. Not to say there aren't pockets of that point of view out there, but the trend in this country has been in a very different direction, a direction toward much more openness, acceptance, pluralism, tolerance, and so forth and so on. And so there's, I think, along those lines of social and cultural issues, you see a greater level of conservatism in both of these countries than you do in the United States. There are some exceptions to that. We can drill down into that in the Q&A section if you'd like. But I do think that that basic point is valid. So with that, let me go to the third section out of 4 and talk about social organization. So we've talked about the individual and how individuals relate to individuals. We've talked about the individual and society, and how the individual relates to the broader social and cultural context in which he or she is operating. Now let's talk about the social context itself, and look at how Russia and China compare to, let's say, the United States. So the first point I would mention, I think, is a fundamental one, and it's a very significant similarity historically and to a degree to the present day in both Russia and China, and a real difference between those countries and the United States. And that's the issue of social control, specifically manifesting itself through, in Russia, the propus, and in China, the hukou, which are documents that tie a person to a particular physical location. Particularly historically, and to a certain degree now, but it's beginning to fade away. In both Russia and the Soviet Union before it, and China, there was a notion of you belonged somewhere. And where you belonged was where you had the permit to reside. Whether that was Moscow or Magnitogorsk or Novosibirsk, or whether that's Beijing or Wuhan or Shanghai or the countryside in China, you belonged in a certain place, and that was where you were supposed to be, and you couldn't leave there without authorization, and you couldn't just up and move and sell your place and get a realtor and put it on the market and go off and take the next job in the next city over. That was not possible. You couldn't do it unless you had, going back to the first point, blot or guanxi, or were able to work the system and use connections to get exceptions to the rule, rare exceptions. But basically, these documents, essentially residency permits, bound you to a particular place. And to a degree, they still exist in these societies, but much more so, I think, in China than in Russia, where, for example, migrant workers who come from the countryside, who want to come into a city, can physically come into the city and move there, but they can't get the documentation necessary to be a legal resident of the city, therefore shutting them out of services such as schools for their kids and medical care and a lot of other things. And it's a huge problem in big Chinese urban centers. So this notion of social control, this notion of trying to keep a lid on things and keep people in certain places in ways that permeate their life in many different ways. For example, where you live is going to dictate what housing you get, what job you get, probably in some sense who you marry, how often you can leave the city or the country, and so forth and so on. In a cascading way, that notion of social control has been historically very prevalent in both countries. It's beginning to change now, but the vestiges of it are still in play. The second point I would make is the bureaucracy. In both Russia and China, certainly the Soviet Union before Russia, the notion of bureaucracy was very pronounced and very present in the lives of average people. A notion of red tape, a notion of the absence of transparency, a notion that it was very cumbersome and difficult to get anything done through the normal channels. You had to kind of know somebody or pay a bribe or find a workaround or go in the back door to get anything done. That's something that was a part of the fabric of life in these two countries for many years, for decades. In fact, arguably even for longer. In this country, in the United States, you don't feel that as much. I don't feel it as much. If we want to get something done, we go, we stand in line for a while, we do it, we get the permit, we get the driver's license, we do our thing, and it's done. You don't have to pay a bribe for it. You don't have to know anybody, you just go down to the DMV. That's sort of the archetypical case. But the bureaucracy in both the Soviet Union and Russia on the one hand and China was much more overbearing, and it was much more, if I can say, in your grill than it was the case here in the United States, even historically. The third point I would make is, and it flows from point number 2, that in both Russia and China there were always many rules, but there were always ways around the rules. So on the one hand, you had more rules than the United States, But on the other hand, in some ways, you could find a way to get through it and work through it in a way that wouldn't be possible here. One example that I would use from my own experience was a time when I tried to take the train in China. And in those days, and this was in the early 1990s, taking a train, it was a bit of a complicated thing. You had to, particularly if you were a foreigner, there were some seats you could sit in and there were others you couldn't. For a while in China, you had regulations where foreigners could only sit in the higher class cabins. They didn't really want foreigners mingling with the average Chinese people and talking to them and things like that. And they said, well, this is for your comfort, and indeed those cabins were nicer, but on the other hand, it was also for other reasons. And anyway, getting tickets sometimes, particularly during high-peak travel seasons like the Spring Festival, the Chinese New Year, was not an easy thing to do. So one time I needed to get on a train, but I didn't have a ticket. And I went and checked through the normal system, and it didn't work. And so I was in a provincial town at that time. And a friend of mine said, let me show you how we do this. And we literally went around to the back door of the station, which happened to be open, walked through it, went up a flight of stairs, down another, through 3 doors, and ended up on the train tracks. And then talked to the person that was managing the car and said, this guy needs to get to Shanghai, can you hook him up, kind of a thing. And we managed to solve the problem that way. It's emblematic of a system that sometimes says no, but peoples in both the Soviet Union and Russia on the one hand and China on the other that were extraordinarily inventive and are extraordinarily inventive about finding ways to beat the system and get around those roadblocks. So that's an interesting dynamic. In this country, could you imagine someone really being able to pull that off in the modern era? Or to get on an airplane or get on a train without the right ticketing, without the right kind of identification and so forth. No, we have few rules, but we enforce the rules that we have. It's against the rules, you're done. It's over, basically. There's always some fix. Fourth point is the notion of closed cities. Both in the Soviet Union and I think in Russia today, indeed in Russia today, I know, and in China, there are cities that are, and parts of the country that are not open to foreigners. They are open to private citizens of their own country. So it's not a question of a military installation, which is off limits to everybody. There are parts of the country in Russia and in China that are closed to foreigners, but that are open to Russians and Chinese. I once made the mistake, unwittingly, of getting too close in Russia to one of those closed areas and getting asked about that by the powers that be and explaining that it was a misunderstanding and so forth. But it made it clear to me that that notion of a closed city or a closed area continues to exist even in the Russian Federation, let alone the Soviet Union, and it's true in China. We don't have that here. We have military bases, but unless you're wearing the uniform and are supposed to be at that base with the proper credentials, it doesn't matter whether you're a senator or anybody else, you're not going to get in there. None of us are, American or foreign, unless you have the right credentials. But there they have a citizen-defined closed area as well. Different notion. Fifth, the system again, or social organization. This issue of poor service, poor customer service, something that was very prevalent in Soviet days and in Chinese, in China as well. It's, I think, improved to a certain degree in Russia and to a fairly significant degree in China. But the notion of the customer is the boss is one that was not prevalent in either Russia or China historically. On the contrary, the notion is that the server is the boss, and you darn well better not offend the server, because if you do, you're never going to get what you ordered. And if you do get it, you're going to get it with a gruff, mean-spirited attitude. That's beginning to change now, but unquestionably, historically, and you see the legacies of this still playing out some. Russia and China, not very customer-friendly places in any respect. And I think that's, I would argue, still more true in Russia today than it is in China. It used to be really obvious in China to anybody, including to Chinese, not just Americans or other foreigners, But I think China, with the enormous market reforms that it's made in recent years, has really moved toward a more customer-oriented experience. Russia, I think, still has a long way to go, I would argue. Not because what I think matters, but if you want to really get on the railroad tracks of the world in terms of the level of world customer service, I don't think Russia's there yet. And that, I think, in both cases, I should note, goes back to the communist legacy of both nations, where it didn't matter whether the customer was happy because there weren't any choices, and it was state-owned, and it was either you take this or you don't. Here's the pair of shoes that's available, whether or not you want it, whether or not it's the right gender, whether or not it's the right size, the right color. You want it, take it. You don't, it doesn't really matter to me. And the next guy or gal will take it. So, that's where it comes from. And I would make a point that I've made many times in speeches, and that is, the issue of, I'll come back to this, but the common communist legacy of both countries, Marxist legacy, and I'm not talking about the fact that China is still a communist country, which it is, but when it was really sort of a dyed-in-the-wool communist country, those kinds of economic and social mores absolutely shattered, obliterated the notion of customer service. And those two economies are still reeling from the impact, and they're reeling from the impact in other ways as well. Education. I think both in Russia and in China, there's more of a sense that education is the purview of a relatively privileged few. Here I'm talking more about college education specifically, I should point out. Both countries historically have had pretty strong primary and secondary educational systems. In fact, Russian primary education, and I think Chinese, are among the top in the world in terms of the amount of knowledge and know-how, and the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, that they instill in kids, and they're to be commended for that. But in terms of college education, both countries historically saw it as a very exclusive club and made it very difficult to get into that club. And if you got into the club and made it through university, then you had a pretty bright future ahead of you. But it was not college for the masses the way we do it here in this country, where if you don't go to Harvard, or you don't go to University of Michigan, you go to Texas, or you go to North Dakota, or you go to Alabama, or some school in this country, you're going to have a way, if you want to, generally speaking, to get into a school and advance your education and move forward and create opportunities for yourself. College for the masses, that's what we do. That's not the norm. It wasn't the norm, and it's still not the norm in Russia and China. Much more of a rigid system. You get in through testing. It's very competitive. The number of slots available was infinitesimal compared to here. And that is beginning to change, particularly in China, with the commercialization of the educational system to a greater degree than was ever the case. But that said, it's still not our concept of college for the masses, college for everybody. So that's something that I think is very true even today. It also goes back to a point that I made earlier, and that is this notion of respect for teachers. Very pronounced in Russia, very pronounced in China. Teachers, including professors, but also teachers at all levels. And not so pronounced in relative terms here in this country. I think in this country we have a bit of an anti-intellectual mindset. We don't like it too much, for example, when, let's just say, presidential candidates sound like they're smarter than us, or even worse, when they seem to think that they are smarter than us. We don't like that. We want them to strike the right balance between, actually being smart enough to run this country, but not thinking that they're smarter than any of us. It doesn't sit well with us as a people. In Russia and China, there's a respect for knowledge. There's a respect for people that have put those paces in and put the effort in to get the degrees and write books and do these things. And I think they hold professors and teachers up at a somewhat higher level of social respect than we do in this country. We have respect, but they take it to a different level. Economic inefficiency. I think Russia still suffers seriously from profound levels of economic inefficiency and dysfunctionality. as an economy that is absolutely a vestige of 70 years of catastrophic, and I emphasize the word catastrophic, economic mismanagement under the communist system, that basically all but ruined the country in many ways for generations. And that, to their credit, the Russian people are working hard to move out of that legacy of inefficiency, of basically a system that simply didn't work, and that ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own inability to function. In the case of China, it set off on a very different course. But again, it started from a baseline of profound economic inefficiency under a centrally planned, centrally controlled system. It has done wonders, absolutely wonders, in the last 30 years. And now, of course, is the second largest economy and is an extraordinarily booming economy and so forth. Great explosion of wealth, more millionaires than all of Europe combined, more billionaires than all of Europe combined, and the list goes on of statistics. That said, China too started from a position of extraordinary inefficiency, and it's still having to play catch up. And some of China's toughest economic challenges today are challenges that, in a sense, it's set up with horrifically bad economic and unenlightened economic policies over recent decades, particularly prior to the last 30 years. So both Russia and China are struggling in some fundamental ways under the legacy of disastrous communist economic policies, and to greater or lesser degrees now are moving out of those shadows. Productivity, another point. This is point number 8. The work productivity at the individual level really took a beating under the communist systems, where, as Russians themselves sometimes joked, the system in the Soviet Union was they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. And that doesn't generate a lot of great economic advancement. It doesn't generate innovation. It doesn't generate the kind of things that you need to have a modern economy that delivers prosperity to a wide swath of people. And so communism in both countries historically took a significant toll on creativity, on the entrepreneurial spirit, on even the notion of professional ambition. And it created this kind of apathy, it created this kind of sense that no matter what you do, it doesn't really matter much. I'm basically going to have this apartment and this Lada vehicle in the popular brand of cars, or Zhiguli in Russia, in the Soviet Union. I'm going to have this set of things in my life in China, etc. And so when you have a system that doesn't reward productivity, that's what you get. So I think in these ways, both Russia and China have a lot in common in terms of dealing with, and they're at very different levels now in their journey toward leaving that behind, but they're both dealing with these kinds of legacy issues. A 9th point, center versus regions. Both Russia and Beijing in some ways are organized at the national level fairly similarly. You have a central authority, and you have regional authorities, and you have local authorities. And effectively there is a hierarchy. While Russia nominally, at least in the 90s and through the early part of the Putin era, was a federal state in which you had a federal authorities, but also, in a sense, self-standing provincial or regional and local authorities. To a degree, that was undone with the undoing of the direct election of governors. And so now you have much more of a system where, oddly enough, Russia has kind of backslid toward more of a socialist, classic socialist style of governance, in which you have a center, you have regions, and you have localities, and in a sense there is a hierarchy there. You have a very similar thing in China, except that it's even more systematic in the sense that that is the way the system is designed. And that's the way it's always been. In this country, you have much more of a true federal system, where there are certain things the federal government can do, and there are certain things the federal government cannot do. And states can fight and win in the Supreme Court of the United States instances where the United States government is overstepping its constitutional federal bounds. So you don't have that in either Russia or China, and I think that center regions kind of mindset is prevalent in both of those societies in a way that it is not here. Let me just say a word about the capitals, Moscow and Beijing versus Washington. I think that both Moscow and Beijing are truly the first cities of these two countries, respectively. Some people from Shanghai and St. Petersburg, I should say, would take issue with those characterizations. But aside from those clear second cities, or also great cities, most people in both China and Russia would look at Beijing and Moscow, respectively, as being the number one city, and the place where people want to go, and the place where everything happens, and so on. In Washington, in this country, it's not the same mindset vis-a-vis Washington. Washington, of course, is our nation's capital, but it's not a place that commands the psychic space in the mind of Americans that Moscow and Beijing do in the minds of Russians and Chinese. It's not the great seat of culture, it's not the great seat of the arts, it's not the great seat of everything else that's worthy and good other than government. It is the center of government. But if anything, the term Washington in this country has a little bit of a negative connotation or taste. It's why when Rick Perry ran for president briefly, in his first speech, which was probably the best speech he gave, his speech in which he announced for president, he said, "I'm running to make Washington as inconsequential to your lives as possible." And that resonated with people. That was when he literally went immediately to number one in the polls, because that notion of making Washington inconsequential to our lives resonates with the average person in a way that it doesn't, I think, certainly from the cultural side in the two countries, Russia and China. Finally, civil society. In Russia and in China, civil society is weak. In America, it's strong. Very, very clear distinction. Are there civil society groups in Russia and in China? Yes. Are there real civil society groups with power? To a certain degree, to a certain limited degree in Russia, yes. In China, not really. In the US, yes, of course. But relatively speaking, both Russia and China have extremely weak civil society. And it comes from the common communist heritage in which the leaderships historically of both countries were extremely distrustful of the notion of individuals forming lateral, spontaneous groups in their countries and doing things on their own outside of the tent of the authority of the parties, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of China, and now, if you will, the United Russia, let's say, in the Russian context. And so you have a situation where in which, as a vestige and legacy of that, civil society is much weaker in these two countries, even today, now that the situation is, even though the situation is somewhat different and slightly more relaxed than it was before. But in comparison with the United States, it may be one of the single biggest and most profound differences in our countries, is that here we have literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of robust civic entities across this country, of all types, shapes, persuasion, sizes, etc., ideologies, whereas that is absolutely not true in either of those countries. Let me conclude with the last section, and that's the question of national identity. And so this is the biggest, the sort of macro level of looking at Russia and China and the United States. I think in the case of Russia and China, you have a very, very profound similarity around the following idea, and that is that these are great civilizations. These are great civilizations with long histories and with great accomplishments. Any Russian would be rightly proud of the enormous achievements of Russia, including long before it was the Soviet Union, and, in fairness, while it was the Soviet Union, particularly in the sciences, and in space, for example, and in the arts to a certain degree, but in the arts for sure predating the Soviet Union. And there's an enormous amount of pride about that history, and which I fully understand and respect. So too, on the Chinese side, there's a sense that this was a great civilization long before there was ever this thing called the United States of America and many other countries. And there's an enormous pride about that civilizational legacy. And I think that we in the United States are obviously a younger people. We are a younger nation. We are kind of an upstart in the world with 200 plus years of history. And we don't sometimes fully take the time to really appreciate that there are cultures and civilizations out there that go back a lot further than we do, and that have a lot of achievements over those millennia or centuries. And I think that's something where the Russians and the Chinese have a great commonality around that civilizational identity, where we come at it from sort of a younger and newer perspective as a nation among nations. Second point that I would make at the level of national identity is the notion of the enormous and really almost unimaginable sacrifices that the Russians and the Chinese have made in their histories. And I'm speaking here mostly, above all, in terms of a loss of life that is unimaginable to any American today. Something we have never experienced. We're literally, over the last century, hundreds of millions of Russians and Chinese have perished from unnatural causes. Hundreds of millions from unnatural causes. In World War II alone, the Soviet Union sacrificed 26 million people dead to help the United States and the Allies, the Alliance, defeat Hitler and defeat the Axis powers in World War II. We lost 250,000. For every one American that was lost, 100 Russians were lost. And ours was an enormous loss, and theirs was 100 times bigger. When I went to Russia for the first time to work, my dad, whose parents came from what was then part of the Russian Empire, what's now in the Ukraine, said to me, he said, David, you know, you're going there to represent the United States, to serve as a spokesman at the embassy, and I know you're proud to represent this country, but when you're in Russia, do me a favor and take one afternoon and go to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and just stand there and think about what this country gave, what the Soviet Union gave in World War II, and recognize that our Soviet allies at that time put 26 million lives down to defeat Hitler. And wherever you disagree with Russia, and we as Americans disagree with Russia today, don't ever forget that sacrifice and respect that sacrifice. And I did that. And to me, that was something that was always important. No matter how we disagreed and no matter what problems there were in the relationship, I've never lost sight of the fact that that is an extraordinary toll to take and an extraordinary amount of life to lay down to defeat a tyrant. Now, China, in different ways, has gone through enormous sacrifices as well. The Cultural Revolution, self-imposed. The Great Leap Forward, self-imposed starvation that killed millions, maybe tens of millions. Some things that weren't self-imposed in terms of World War II and the atrocities committed by Japan during World War II. But the bottom line is Russia and China have undergone loss of life and catastrophic histories in a way that we as Americans cannot fully understand. And I think at least to understand that, to understand that we can't understand it is something. But it's something that I think is an enormous difference between our countries. We as a nation generally have had a pretty blessed existence, and they haven't by any means, and I think we need to respect that. Third point, there's a sense of once and future greatness in both Russia and China. Both countries felt they were great. Both countries felt that they deteriorated. Peoples of both countries sensed that deterioration, that in some cases collapse, the disintegration and dismemberment of the Soviet Union itself, so that that country is no more, but now it's the Russian Federation and other republics. But there was a sense that we were great, and there is also a sense of we can and we will be great again. I think that latter sense is more pronounced in China, frankly, than in Russia. The latter sense of, and we will be great again. I would argue that the notion of we will be great again is probably the defining ideology of China. It's not just growth for growth's sake, but if you look at what does the leadership of the country want to achieve, I think first and foremost they want to maintain their monopoly on power, first of all. But aside from that, as a substantive objective of state, the objective is for China to restore its greatness, because it was a great nation long before many of the current great nations were great nations, and their sense is that they have a rendezvous with that level of greatness again. I think in Russia's case, there was a sense that Russia was great, including under the Soviet Union, including, for that matter, under Stalin, as horrific as he was as a dictator. But the fact is this was a nation that put men in space, that fought the United States to a duel for a while in terms of nuclear arms in the arms race. Thank God it was never a hot war. But there's a sense of, obviously Russia is not at that level now, but I think there's a desire on the part of President Putin and the leadership of Russia to move back in that direction. Another similarity at the national identity level is the question of the fact that both Russia and China are large multi-ethnic societies with one dominant group. And it's that latter point that differentiates Russia and China on the one hand from the United States on the other. So, for example, in the case of Russia, obviously the Russian ethnicity is the dominant ethnicity, certainly in Russia, but even in the Soviet Union. But there are many other ethnicities, nationalities, if you will, in Russia. In China, so too is the Han nationality or ethnicity, the dominant ethnicity, but there are also another 54 or 55 other ethnicities formally recognized by the Chinese constitution, by the Chinese state, and the Communist Party. Tibetans, Mongolians, and many, many others. And so, still, you have the dominance of the Russians in Russia and the dominance of the Han Chinese in China. And so you have a kind of nation-state phenomenon in both Russia and in China, in the sense of an ethnic majority, constituting the majority of the population in both of those countries, that is seen as kind of the core, if you will, of the country, at least de facto, if not de jure. And thus all the leaders and so forth come from that one nationality, historically, with perhaps some exceptions. But in the United States, that is not the case. In the United States, we come from everywhere, as we know, nation of immigrants. And there's no one, quote, ethnicity in the sense of national origin that is the dominant ethnicity. There are larger pluralities and smaller pluralities, but there's no one that is the dominant in the way that is true there. We're not a nation state in that regard, in the way that they are. Modernity. I think this is a big topic. It could be a talk, an hour-long talk in its own right. And for those who want to stay afterwards, with Oliver's blessing, I'll do another hour on that. No, but just a minute or so here. This notion of modernity, I think, is one that separates Russia and China, or at least historically Russia and China, from the United States. America is a modern nation. In a sense, we've always been a modern nation. Doesn't mean we've always been perfect. Doesn't mean we're perfect now. But relative to our nation-state peers, we have always been more at the cutting edge of modernity, whether it's in political organization, whether it's in social organization, certainly whether it's been in terms of economics, science and technology, innovation, the knowledge economy, and the list goes on. We are we're a modern nation. It's in our DNA. We were born on a particular day to give expression to a particular set of political values, political truths even. And because we were born on a certain day, we sort of started with a clean slate on July 4th, 1776, and we took it from there. And relative to other nations on that day, we were modern. And relative to other nations today, we're pretty modern. Now, Russia and China, on the other hand, are more traditional societies. And one of the fundamental issues that I think both countries have grappled with, I would say struggled with, but perhaps now they're grappling more successfully with, is the idea of what does it mean to be both Russian and modern? What does it mean to be both Chinese and modern? We know what it means to be both American and modern. It means to be American. That's all it is. That's all we are. But in Russia and China, there is more of a binary distinction. And I remember once in China, I had an opportunity to take part in helping shape a television show. I was involved a little bit in the television industry when I was there. And some friends at Beijing Television asked me to come in and help plan a TV show that they were doing in 1996 or 97 that was designed to showcase modern Chinese culture. And we sat around the table and we said, how do you blend in 1996 and 97, not today, China with modernity? What is both Chinese and modern? And for the life of us, a bunch of us, and I was the only foreigner sitting there with a bunch of other Chinese, were hard-pressed to find a way to bridge that. Because in a certain sense, Chinese culture, as it was popularly construed at that time, was almost seen to be antithetical to modernity in certain ways. It was more traditional, it had certain views about the world, certain views about the whole range of issues that we've talked about. The individual's interaction in society and so on, technology. And so that's been a struggle. However, for me, where I think it crystallized that China had really sort of crossed this bridge and now is on the other side of it, in a way that I'm not 100% sure Russia is yet, was the 2008 Beijing Olympic opening ceremony, which I think will go down as one of the watershed events in the history of China. In 5,000 years, that night, I guess it was night their time, or anyway, I think I saw it at night, whatever it was, time difference-wise, that night will literally be one of the key nodes out of maybe 5 or 8 out of a history of 5,000 years, because it was the night when the Chinese people showed that you could be modern and Chinese and modern at the same time. And it came together in a way that was one of the most phenomenal displays of human inventiveness that I've seen in my lifetime. And I think most of the world felt that. And I think most of the world felt that no matter who hosts the Olympics, including us or anyone else, you might never rise again to what that was relative to the date that it occurred in terms of the weaving together into a coherent fabric of uniquely Chinese cultural sources and a level of technology and a modern mindset that blended seamlessly. So, but this notion of modernity, I think, is one that people who want to look at Russia and China need to focus on as well. Russia, I think, still has a ways to go to find where that modern Russia really is. As our good friend Vladimir, who I think is still listening, knows, this notion of what is Russia, what is the Russian soul, what is Russia's future, what is Russia's role as a nation among nations, these big fundamental philosophical questions that many of us have discussed in kitchens across Moscow and across the country. And some of my fondest memories were those discussions over endless cups of tea late into the night with good friends. Those are questions that still, I would use this word advisedly, that still agonize the Russian soul. There's a book called The Agony of the Russian Idea. And I think they choose this term because there is this grappling that's inside of Russians to understand what is the next chapter in Russia's story. So that, I think, is the notion of modernity is a key theme. Number 6, again under national identity, emphasis on past accomplishments relative to contemporary and future achievements. Historically, and this has changed, I think, since I first gave this presentation. But let me make the point and then explain the caveat. Historically, I think Russians and Chinese have been predisposed to, if you ask them, what are you proudest of about your culture? As I've asked many Russians and Chinese over the years, because I want to know. I want to know what makes Russians and Chinese tick. And so over 30 years, almost 30 years of going back and forth to China and 16 years of going back and forth to Russia, I've asked that question of a lot of people. And for many years, what you would hear from both Russians and Chinese are historical answers. You would hear people in Russia talk about the extraordinary literature, the extraordinary authors, who truly are among the handful of greats in all the world. You would hear about ballet, about these phenomenal painters, about the almost indescribable level of artistic wealth and richness in that country. You would hear about the scientific achievements of the Soviet Union, about space, and about standing toe-to-toe with the United States, and a number of other things like that. But you never heard anybody say anything in the 1990s or early 2000s about contemporary Russia that they would put in that list. This is from Russians. Similarly, if you ask Chinese, what makes you proud? They would say 5,000 years of history. The teachings of Confucius, our religious values of Buddhism and Taoism, extraordinary literature, poetry, artwork, key inventions that have significance in the world, even today. A level of civilization relative to the times that was second to none, and the list goes on. But in the 1990s and 2000s, you rarely heard Chinese say much about the present day. Now, what I would say, and I do hope Vladimir and others, and Ryan and others will come in who have deep experience in Russia and China, and offer thoughts and disagreements and comments and your perspectives and so on. But what I would say is I think today Chinese have, in their own conversation, point a lot more to contemporary achievements now that they're proud of as a nation than Russians do presently. And I'm not saying that there aren't achievements. I'm saying how Russians talk about their achievements and how Chinese talk about their achievements now has started to change, but it's changed a lot more with the Chinese. So today, if you say, what are you proud of to a Chinese person, the list that they'll rattle off includes a 30-year run of economic growth that is unprecedented in the history of humanity, period. That's number one. Number two, explosion of wealth. Number three, the skylines of Beijing, Shanghai, and other great cities. Number four, manned flight in space. They're only the third nation to do it after the United States and the Soviet Union and Russia. Number five, extraordinary Olympic prowess. The team to beat in many, many sports. They're number one, number two. They're competing now with the United States at the top of the medal counts every year. The Beijing Olympics 2008 opening ceremony. The level of innovation that is starting to be generated, the exports, the advances in high-tech fields like telecommunications, notwithstanding some of the troubles they're having getting into this market in this country. But the fact is, the list is long. And so you hear a set of more contemporaneous references to what Chinese are proud of and modern contemporary greatness and accomplishments. There is a question, I think, about, what do Russians look at today and say, what is it about our country today that is making us proud to be Russians? And I, for one, fall into the camp that I think Russia is a great country with a great people, a great history, capable of great things in this world. I'm a fan of Russian culture. I have many friends who I know and love and care for. But I would say to my Russian friends, what is it today that you look at and where are you relative to where you want to go? I think those are the questions at the heart of Russia's existence, and they've been there for a while, and they're there now. I certainly hope that, out of a sense of respect for and affection for my friends from Russia, that Russia has its best days ahead of it. Last couple of points before concluding briefly. Also on the national identity, I think, rubric, there's a great sensitivity in both Russia and China to criticism from foreigners. There's a lot of sensitivity around, a foreigner, or in my case, let's say an American, or in many of our cases, coming in and saying, you know what, here's what I like about your country, but here's what I think your country's doing wrong. Let me give you a list of 10 things. Particularly historically, and I think it's still true now to a degree, neither country likes to get that criticism from a foreigner. Even when around Russian kitchen tables for decades, or Chinese kitchen tables, people are unapologetic about leveling serious criticism on their own leaders, their own country, their way of doing things, and the bureaucracy and the red tape and the bribery and the corruption and everything else in Soviet times and communist times and so on. But it stings more when they hear it from a foreigner. So I think both Russians and Chinese are more sensitive to that in a way that I don't perceive Americans to be quite as sensitive. At least I'm not. I don't think most of us are. No one to similar criticism coming from foreign citizens about the United States. So the way I would put it is no one criticizes the United States more harshly than Americans, period. Nobody bashes, blasts, lambasts, and rips to shreds our country. Our president, our senators, our congressmen, our senate, our legislatures, our leaders, our mayors, our business leaders, our bankers, our Wall Street folks, more than we do. We tear them to shreds every day on television, on Fox, on MSNBC, on the news shows, on the newspapers, on blogs. Nobody does it better. So it doesn't bother us too much when somebody, at least it doesn't bother me, when someone from Mexico, Russia, China, or any other place says, you guys have issues with your national finances, or with crime, or with your educational attainment, or test scores, or whatever it is they want to criticize. I say to them, join the crowd. You can't say anything about this country that hasn't been said by 1 million Americans already, probably this morning. So that's an interesting distinction, I think, between Russia and China on the one hand and the United States on the other. I think there is a kind of nationalism at play there around criticism that we don't see at play in our country. Similarly, there's a deep sense of what I would call ethnic or ethno-patriotism. Again, Russia and China being nation states, not just nations, or countries, but nation states where there is a Russian and a Chinese core component from an ethnic or, quote, nationality standpoint, as the Russians are putting it. But here in the United States, our patriotism is not an ethnic patriotism. It is we are absolutely patriotic. We love this country. And I know I get literally goosebumps every single time that I hear the national anthem before a football game. I'm a football fan, not a baseball fan. I literally almost am in tears every single time. If I watch 3 games on Sunday, which I would never do, of course. Actually, I do every Sunday. If I watch 3 games, 1 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and 8:30, 3 times that day I get goosebumps. And I think many of us, most of us, are like that in different ways. But it's not about an ethnicity. It's about the ideas that were at the core of the founding of this nation. The ideas expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I think most Americans, almost all Americans, I think, whatever our political persuasions, embrace the core and central ideas at the heart of our nation with something like a religious fervor. I know I do. I think almost all of us do at some level. And as some have said, democracy is our civic religion in this country. But that's what we're patriotic about. But in Russia and China, there's also in the mix this notion of the Russian people as an ethnic group and the Chinese people, the Han people as an ethnic group. So that when you say Chinese, or when you say Russian, in the mind of the Chinese and the Russian, I would argue, and I think most would agree, some would disagree, but most would agree in this country, you're also saying something about the ethnicity of the person. You're not just commenting about the citizenship and the color of the passport. But in the United States, when you say American, you're not making any statement. You can't be making any statement about the ethnicity because American embraces people from every corner of the earth. And then finally, negative nationalism. U.S. nationalism tends to be very positive. Negative nationalism tends to be very negative. Sorry, that's self-evident. Russian and Chinese nationalism, rather, tends to be somewhat more negative than positive. Somewhat more. I'm not saying exclusively. Are there things that Russians and Chinese are proud of? Yes, we've rattled off a lot of them on both sides. And there's an extraordinary record in both countries to be proud of. But you do sense, and I think it's, in fairness to Russia, I think it's more on the Chinese side than it is on the Russian side. A negativity, a sharpness that is against something as much as it's for something. And you see this in China most recently over the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands dispute, where there's this huge nationalism that's there, and there's a dispute with Japan over these islands in the East China Sea. And all of a sudden, you've got people standing in front of the Japanese embassy, hurling things at the embassy, rotten fruit, in some cases other objects, smashing Japanese cars in the streets of Beijing after pulling people out of those cars. And the list goes on. The blogosphere is alight with this kind of negative, sharp criticism, even to the point of almost incendiary type of level of exhortation. You see that a lot in China. You don't see that so much even in Russia, but there's elements of it where you see some of these comments by officials, whether it's President Putin himself, whether it's the people around him, whether it's legislators, whether it's others in Russian society, who see sometimes the U.S. hand behind certain events, whether it's the demonstrations at last December or later, and who sometimes will say, it's us against them, as I kind of noted earlier. There's a little bit of an edge, but I would say not as much of a negative nationalistic edge with Russia as with China. With China, it's unmistakable and it's clear, and I think incontestable, that there is a negative aspect to that nationalism that we don't see here. I was struck, and then I'll come to the last section. I was struck that when the United States laid down Osama bin Laden earlier this year, there really wasn't a lot of jubilation in the streets. There were some kids from universities in Washington, D.C. that walked a short distance to the gates of the White House. A couple of hundred, we saw them on TV. But around this country, there really wasn't anyone in the streets. Maybe some folks here in New York went down to, in fact, did go down to the Twin Towers and had a moment of a sense of victory over the individual that masterminded these horrific attacks. But basically, there wasn't a kind of pandemonium, nor was there the next day or any day thereafter. We just got on with our business. And even though we had taken out an arch enemy of this country in the modern era, there wasn't a sense of sort of this mean-spirited, negative, we got you and we're going to rub it in your face for the next 6 months kind of thing. And I think that speaks well, frankly, of our country. We take care of our business and we move on. So anyway, there is a difference there. Now, let me just quickly conclude with 2 points. One, I want to briefly reference what I think are some important differences between Russia and China, and then literally 2 lines of conclusion. I'll be done in about 5 minutes or so. So, having said that Russia and China are very similar in a number of ways across these 4 categories, individual and society, social organization, national identity. About 7 or 8 points in each one of those 4 categories. I think there are a couple of areas, a couple of points in each category where there are significant differences between Russia and China. Let me lay those out. Number one, interpersonal. I think Russians tend to be a little bit gruffer than Chinese. There's a little bit more seriousness, a little bit more reservedness, a little bit more, I guess, less of a willingness to engage with people that are not immediately known. I think Chinese are a little bit more out in front, particularly vis-a-vis foreigners, and I would say, dare I say, particularly vis-a-vis Americans, about being sort of open, smiling, laughing, kind of ready to engage. And I think there's a slight difference there that I've definitely perceived. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but I think that's a very real distinction. That's under interpersonal. The second category, individual and society. There are a number of things one can point to, just to give you a couple of items here to consider. The problem of alcohol in Russia is much greater than it is in China. It may sound like a trivial point to make, but the consequences of alcoholism in Russia have been profound, unfortunately. In fact, they've been tragic, and it's a very serious problem. It's not a serious problem in China at the national level. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's not. Alcohol doesn't have the place in the Chinese psyche that it does in the Russian psyche, and there are social consequences that stem from that. Similarly, unfortunately, drug use in Russia is considerably higher. Jackie's involved in our work on Afghan narco-trafficking and knows that our Russian friends have told us that I think there are 2 million or 3 million heroin addicts, if I'm not mistaken, in Russia, and a lot of hard drugs that happen there, unfortunately. Certainly there are in the United States as well, no question about that. To a much lesser degree is that the case in China, so there's a difference there. So some of the social problems you see somewhat more accented in Russia, unfortunately, than in China. Crime and violence, again, I think Russia has a somewhat higher level of violent crime per capita than China does. One can go back to various historical reasons and other things that explain that. Obviously, in the United States, we have rather high levels of violent crime, and so I'm not sitting in judgment of anyone. In fact, in many ways, our levels of violent crime are higher than Russia's. But the point that I'm drawing here is that as a social phenomenon, there are some differences between Russia and China here. And I think some other things that one could point to. In terms of social organization, there's been a big difference, I think, that's emerged between Russia and China, where Russia, I think, is on, frankly, the favorable side of the ledger. And that is in reference to the press. Unfortunately, today, the media in Russia is not as free as it was when I was living and working in Russia in the late 90s, when it was rather free, mischievous, rambunctious, and kind of did its thing and said what it wanted to say. It's been reined in since then, but still, today in Russia, there are a number of media, particularly the internet, but also a few other media organizations such as Echo Moskvy and a number of others, radio stations, a few newspapers and others, not so much television, that nonetheless can really tell it like it is, can level criticism of the president and the administration in Russia, can speak its mind, and can lay out ideas pretty freely without getting cracked down on, particularly on the internet. The internet basically in Russia is free. It's completely free, I would say. People can say what they want, and generally do. That is not true in China. In China, the media is not free. And there's a very, very big difference on the role that the media plays in both countries. Yes, there's the blogosphere. Yes, people have more room to comment about things than they ever have had, true, but it's still not free in the sense that ultimately what you can say or cannot say is dictated to you by the leadership of the country. That's the way it is. So there's a big difference in social organization in that regard. Finally, with regard to national identity, and I'll just rattle these off, Russians tend to be more pessimistic, Chinese tend to be more optimistic, Russians tend to be more impatient in some ways. Chinese sometimes can be maddeningly patient from a U.S. perspective. We can delve into that a little bit more, but that may be a bit of a moving target. Americans, just to put it in perspective or to contextualize the point I'm trying to make, Americans are very impatient. We want change, we want it now. We want technology, we want it now. We want a song on our iPod this second. We want to update Facebook right now. And the list goes on important things and unimportant things. We want it now. Chinese tend to be historically very patient. So they tend to see the world in terms of, as Deng Xiaoping and many others have famously said, let's see where we are in 50 or 100 years, and then we'll talk again. Or as Zhou Enlai, the great premier of China, famous premier of China, famously said, someone asked him what in early 1970s, what do you think of the French Revolution? He said, I think it's still too early to tell. So there's a maddening patience on the Chinese side. And to a degree, one can maybe debate with me whether there's more impatience on the Russian side, but we can get into that later. Finally, and then I'll conclude with two sentences, national identity, the last point I would say, difference between Russia and China. I think there is a deep cynicism on the Russian side, and there is not a cynicism as much on the Chinese side. There's almost a little bit more innocence, I think, to a degree. Differences of degree. But there's an enormous level of cynicism on the Russian side that I've seen that you don't hear as much when you talk to Chinese. Let me conclude by saying that I'm fascinated by both Russia and China. I've spent a long time working on these countries. I'm privileged to have the opportunity now to work on these countries and to learn more with each day. I hope that you found some interesting points in my presentation today. I'm grateful for your superhuman patience, and I look forward to any questions or comments that we have in the 14 seconds that remain in our time. No, seriously, in the 10 minutes that we have. And again, thank you to Brussels. Thanks to Vladimir and to Raymond, who are calling in from Moscow and Washington, and to all of you here in New York. I'm grateful for your time and look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes.
So, most of the bullet points that you made made me think of this one question. I'm not a historian, but I get a sense that the U.S. used to be in most of these categories that you talked about at some point in their history, and they kind of have evolved and moved on or changed, or what have you. And I feel if that is the case, is that possible for that same process to happen for Russia and China? And if so, why has it taken so long? Would that have to do maybe with their struggles and with that kind of having their own problems, so to speak, or if you could just.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a great question, and I think countries do change and evolve, cultures evolve. American society obviously is very different today in many ways, including interpersonal and individual dealing with social organizations and so forth, relative to where we ourselves were, just as you rightly point out, 100 years ago, 70 years ago, 50 years ago. That's true. And I do think that's a process of kind of a natural maturing as a nation and as a culture that all cultures go through to greater or lesser degrees, or with greater or lesser degrees of speed and kind of smoothness. I think when you look at countries like Russia and China, which are not only countries and not only cultures, but also really vast civilizations. Certainly in the case of China, one could use the term civilization by the definition of the term civilization. I would use the term about Russia. Some may question whether that counts as a, quote, civilization, but I think it's right about that level. And when you look at civilizations at that level, you have to start to disaggregate the sources of why it is the way it is. Part of the story is the innate elements of Russian culture and Chinese culture, respectively. Part of it is the special histories that these countries went through under communism, most recently, but also in their own histories, the ideas that shaped these nations along the way through the centuries. Not just communism most recently, and in the case of China, it still exists, of course, as the ruling, at least nominally, the ruling ideology. But you go back hundreds or thousands of years, and you can start to put together an explanation for why these countries see things the way they do. And because those explanations are deep-rooted. I think it takes a long time to sort through them. And so what I think we've seen in the case of both countries is it is possible to change. It is possible to move in a different direction. Ultimately, the people can make that happen at a speed that they're comfortable with. I think the Chinese have moved surprisingly quickly in their march toward a more modern identity, a more modern Chinese identity, let's say, or in any case, a different Chinese identity. And I think that it can happen. But when you're dealing with cultures that go back hundreds or thousands of years, it's much harder to change the fundamental direction of those cultures than it is to change a culture that goes back 200 plus years, because we don't have those enormous roots in our own history that kind of stymie those efforts to change in the short term. The last point I would make in response to this is that there's a notion that I talk about, and I've talked about for a few years, called, I call it diplomacy as psychology. And the way I put it is you can learn more about how nations interact with each other, and in fact how they see themselves through the writings of Freud than you can through the writings of Kissinger or Clausewitz. Because ultimately, nations are led by leaders or governments, and ultimately, those are individuals who have certain personal histories and personal understandings of their nation's histories. And it becomes very psychological. So to understand where America is today as the world's only superpower, you have to look back at our history and understand how events shaped our national mindset. And so too, to understand why the Russians and Chinese are the way they are, I think you have to delve into the psychology of these countries. And that's something I think that scholars of international relations don't give enough attention to. But it goes back to your question, because the way ultimately to figure out how to get where you want to go, if you're Russia or if you're China, or if you're the Russian people or the Chinese people, is to, number one, know where you want to go. Size that up relative to where you are, but fundamentally know where you've been and why you are the way you are, so that you can make the course corrections that are necessary. I think there needs to be a level of kind of introspection. I would almost say psychological introspection, to get to a point where you can start making those changes. And to a certain degree, this country, I think, is more open to the psychological process. We put ourselves on the couch a lot in this country, for better or worse, but I think it does open up ideas, and it helps us move beyond things and course correct and fix our many mistakes. Either we're on Jeopardy or... yes, ma'am.
I have a question in regards to the courtyard issue or whatnot, and how it's kind of like that's not my problem, I'm not going to take care of that. And I did see that in Russia when I was there, but I have a question if you think that translates to charities and foundations and donations in those countries, and how the people just, as far as I see, they just don't give these new rich, the new middle class and whatnot, don't have that idea of giving back. As we see in America, you see everything is donated. There's that little plaque on every bench in New York City, I'm convinced, and parks and whatnot. And so do you see that phenomenon stem from that, this courtyard problem, I guess? And furthermore, do you see that changing, and how so? Can it change in the people's mindset? Because that has been ingrained for so long. And how many generations would it take to...
That's a very, very good point. I absolutely agree with what you've said. And in fact, there's a very different philosophy of giving and philanthropy in Russia and China on the one hand than there is in this country. And in the United States, we give $250 billion a year to charity. That's in fact, it's probably north of that now. That may be a dated statistic. But probably close to $300 billion a year. And per capita, I don't think any country gives billion, 300 billion, yeah, with the B, and that's an enormous amount of money. And on a per capita basis, thank you, Jackie, much obliged, thank you very much. on a per capita basis, we give, I think, probably more than any other nation on earth. I think that's accurate. But if we're not number one, we're up in the very top echelons. It's a part of our sense of giving back, recognizing that whatever our successes, and I don't mean to be political here, but there were people that contributed to those successes, even if those people were our mom and dad, our brothers and sisters, or teachers or others. And so there's a sense of giving back. It's in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which I would argue is the firmament that undergirds political thought in this country, and that frankly undergirds the notion of being endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and so forth. And so that leads to a way of looking at the world where we give back. And that goes back even to Carnegie, Mellon, and Rockefeller and all the others from the old days. But it's certainly evident now with Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and many, many others who give billions and billions and billions and billions. Billions. But in Russia and China, we don't see that. You're right. And I think part of it is this communist legacy where it's ironically and perversely, ultimately, it was all about, it's about me. It's about me getting ahead. I can't afford to spend time worrying about others because it's hard to get ahead in the system and I have to worry about me and my family. And it was that mindset that perversely, communism, I think, inculcated in the minds of everybody that lived under that system. And whereas capitalism, if you will, generated a mindset of giving back somehow or other. Now, the other part of it, I think, is there's just a very different history, and so part of it is ideological, and the vestiges of these ideologies, but part of it is the sort of inherent cultural milieus and the civilizational traditions that don't seem to place as much of an accent on that. And there is charitable giving, of course, in China and in Russia, we know that. But it's not at the scale that we see in many other countries. Relative to GDP, relative to per capita GDP, but it's not at the levels one would expect. And this points, I think, to another significant consideration, which is the fact that the Soviet Union and China, and to a certain degree Russia now and China, are countries that were not wealthy countries, and people were not wealthy. And it was more of a mindset of conservation and a mindset of, I have limited resources and I need to conserve and take care of those closest to me. And I don't in any way judge that. I think that's a perfectly appropriate mindset. But I think when you have a nation of affluence, you think differently about how you distribute wealth than when you have a nation where the overwhelming majority of people have very little. And that was true in the Soviet Union. And that is true even today in China, although there's been astounding levels of growth that have affected many hundreds of millions. But there's a few other 100 million that still haven't gotten that. So it's going to take a long while, I think, for us to see the kind of real, truly altruistic giving spirit that we see in the United States and in other countries. I do see, being in the fundraising business to a degree, I've had conversations with Russians and with Chinese and about funding EWI and so on. And one thing I often get back is sort of a very hard-edged comment of what do we get out of this? And at a certain level, let's be honest, in the final analysis, when you give $1 million or 100,000 or 20,000 to EWI or to anybody, it's really just because you have the money, you have the capacity, and you want to try to make a difference and make the world a little better place, and maybe you believe in what we're doing. And in the end, it's not really about adding value. It's not about putting up another factory somewhere or lowering the prices, or you can't judge it in bottom line terms. That 250 billion or 300 billion that Americans give every year is really not about the bottom line. And if you're asking about the bottom line, then you're not in the philosophical mindset that people are in this country when we talk about it. So it's going to be hard for me or for any of us, I would argue, some would maybe disagree, to say that really this is a bottom line decision for you. Ultimately, it has to be, you've been tremendously successful, sir or madam. We'd be grateful for your assistance because this is just kind of a good thing to do, and we do great work. And if you believe in it, give. And if you don't, then that's your prerogative. but it's a different kind of mindset. And that just accentuates the point that you make, and I think it's going to take a while. I think there's a movement in that direction, but I think it's going to take a good while for that to sink in, for the reasons that I mentioned.
Well, thank you, David.
Thank you.
For those very interesting 2 hours.
Thanks.
And there are no more questions. Maybe there's a question from Belgium.
No, everything's okay here.
Okay. Perfect.
Just wanted to say, thank you very much for such a comprehensive description of the differences and commonalities between Russian and Chinese cultures. And I would say that as far as Russia is concerned, I'm mostly in agreement with everything you said. At the same time, we could go deeper into various details which would show contradictions in various layers of society, which have different cultural blueprints. But probably this is something for another few hours.
Absolutely. Vladimir, first of all, thank you. You're coming to Washington soon, if I'm not mistaken, and I look forward to many hours of digging into the details. But in all seriousness, I would really value your further comments. I know we're out of time now, but let's consider it the start of the conversation, because I would very much like to hear your insights on that. And thank you for your comments.
Okay, sure. It would be great to come to New York to have a closer business.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we'll have a two-part dialogue in Washington and New York.
Okay.
So, and thank you guys so much again. Oliver, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I look forward to continuing to talk about these ideas, and I'm really grateful for your superhuman patience and the great questions as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.